Kofi Annan at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, welcome to Hard Talk.
Happy to be here with you.
Thank you. So you've had a very busy retirement since you left the United Nations. Do you think that the world is a more troubled place today than it was when you left the UN?
First of all, I've discovered retirement is hard work, but one has to keep at it. I think I went through difficult moments at the UN. You've referred to some of them, including the Iraq War. But the world is particularly messy today when we look at what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening in some parts of Africa, some parts of Asia, and also the fact that I don't see the strong leaders around who could cope with it.
So you don't think there are strong leaders in the world today? I mean, there's Donald Trump in the White House, and he's making very strong, robust statements about Syria now, for instance, saying that the suspected chemical attack in Douma that we've just seen recently killing dozens of people, including children, needs a robust response. Yeah,
different people have different definitions of leadership. I believe that leadership is not about the individual. When you have macho leaders who believe they have to shine and it all has to be about them, forgetting that what is required is the welfare of society and the people they serve.
Are you referring to Donald Trump, though? Because when you look at what's happened in Syria, so many people are appalled by that recent attack, and we saw one also last year. And, you know, he referred to Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, as a gas-killing animal. Yeah. And he has said, we've got to have a response, get ready for nice, new, smart missiles in Syria.
I don't approve of that. Not only don't I approve of that, I like the Secretary General's position. He said, what is required...
Secretary General of the UN, Antonio
Guterres, said, what is required is unfettered investigation to determine who was responsible, hold them to account, and ensure that impunity is not allowed to stand. And we, the elders issued a statement which I, as chairman, share very much, that what we need is cool heads and sober judgment. We cannot allow situations where leaders threaten war on television or on Twitter. Do we base ourselves on facts or speed? We've seen this before. We had investigations.
Cool heads and sober judgment, ladies and gentlemen. These were the words of Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, 4 years ago, in this very auditorium, then speaking about Syria. Today we speak about Ukraine. Welcome to this town hall today, and welcome to all those also who are joining us online. In these very dark moments, as an institute, we do have a responsibility to stay true to our vision. The Graduate Institute opens creative spaces for diverse communities and fosters the understanding and engagement essential to a peaceful and equitable and sustainable world. This town hall is part of this very vision, because what is happening in Ukraine and in the world might be called the 9/11 of the 2020s. A major fundamental systemic event that changes many things. Now, in this town hall, we set ourselves the objective to draw on the academic foundations of the Institute across disciplines and fields of thematic expertise with various speakers, but also with all of you who hold this expertise in the Institute from both various disciplines, from an interdisciplinary perspective, but also from the places of where you are. As an institute, we also have not remained neutral. We have supported the call of Swiss universities to European governments, and I cite, to take immediate action to protect the lives and careers of Ukrainian university staff, students, researchers, and civil society actors, as well as the entire Ukrainian population. I would also recall the statement of Director Marie-Laure Salle from Tuesday, where she said, "War is always a defeat for humanity." We think with sadness and solidarity of the women, men, and children who have seen their lives turned upside down and their future darkened in a few hours. We admire the courage of the Ukrainian people and share the suffering of the families who have lost loved ones since 24th of February. End of citation. Director Salle sends her apologies because she is ill. And in lieu of her, I'm leading the discussion today in this town hall meeting. I'm Achim Wennemann. I'm the Director for Strategic Partnerships of the Graduate Institute and an ardent observer of key peace and security issues for many years at the Graduate Institute. Now, in 1 week of war, we have seen a lot of casualties already. The first official figures suggest that there are 498 dead Russian soldiers, which is a Russian estimate, which is compared to an estimate of 7,000 dead Russian soldiers by Ukrainian sources. There are also estimates by UNHCR that at least over 1 million people have fled Ukraine, and it has called the situation an exodus. Of course, there are many more civilian dead on the Ukrainian side and also on Ukrainian soldiers, but there are currently no estimates to this. So as we are talking about Ukraine today, I would like to emphasize the seriousness of the discussion, the amount of death and sorrow which is associated, but also our importance as an institute to share light and clarity on all these developments as they are happening. Now, to do this, we have thought to structure the town hall to start with a number of kickoff reflections by colleagues, and then to extend the discussion to all of you, with the ambition, of course, that is framed by our vision in order to foster understanding and engagement essential to a peaceful, equitable, and sustainable world. So, and with these words, I'd like perhaps to welcome my colleagues on stage. It was, of course, difficult among the wide expertise that we have to identify just as single individuals to start off. But we want to emphasize this is a kickoff for our broader conversation, particularly with all of you who study here or who do research here, that we will come to as we move forward. So, Marcello, and since this is a town hall meeting, we go on first names because this is a small town and we all know each other, of course. So, Marcello, you are professor of international law and the secrétaire général de l'Institut de droit international. From a perspective of international law, how do you help us understand what is happening?
Well, thank you, Achim. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say at the outset that this event remembers me another similar one that we organized at the Graduate Institute, not in this impressive building, nearly 20 years ago when there was the invasion of Iraq. So now we are in Europe and we are assisting of the gravest military action since the end of the Second World War. So I have to summarize in 5 minutes the situation from an international law perspective. It's a difficult exercise. I will try, Achim, respecting the allocated time. So first of all, we have to remember the first step followed by Putin's government, which was the recognition of the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, which was evidently, from a legal perspective, a blatant breach of the principle of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of other states. But it was also the first step in order to try to justify the military intervention that followed under the plea of collective self-defense. So the so-called independent republics then requested the Russian Federation to come in self-defense. Obviously, this is not the legal situation. In order to invoke self-defense, you need the existence of an armed attack by Ukraine. It was not the case. Even if it were the case, even if it would have been the case, so the reaction in self-defense must be necessary and proportionate. And when you look at the dimension of the Russian invasion and military action in Ukraine, you realize that these two conditions, necessity and proportionality, are not met. So, if we have to characterize the military invasion of Russia in Ukraine, we can say that it is a blatant case of aggression, that it is a breach of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, that it is a breach of the right of the Ukrainian people to self-determination, and it is also a breach of the principle of non-intervention in the domestic affairs. And also, particularly, these are the fundamental principles of international law. But also there are specific obligations that Russia accepted in the Budapest Agreement, by which, in 1994, by which Ukraine accepted to become a denuclearized state, and Russia engaged itself to respect the independence and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So this amounts to international legal consequences, not only the state responsibility of the Russian Federation, but also the individual responsibility of those having decided and acted in such a manner. Because, as you know, there are international crimes that were recognized, for instance, in the Statute of the International Criminal Court, and now it is also included the crime of aggression. So there is individual responsibility, and also, if we have to refer to war crimes, the individual responsibility is also engaged. The problem with the Putin's arguments are that, to some extent, they are the members of the Russian government, they are using similar arguments that were developed by the Western states in the past. For instance, when there was the bombing of the then Federal Republic of Yugoslavia with regard to the Kosovo crisis, or the invasion of Iraq by the United States and the United Kingdom. So now Putin is invoking the reaction to an alleged crime of genocide, the protection of the civilian population in the Donbass, the fight against terrorism, etc., etc. And then if you look at some symbolic action, military actions that this Russian regime is following, you see the attempt by Putin to show some similarities or parallelism with regard to the action developed by the Western countries. For instance, the bombing of the television in Kiev. So some of you may remember also the bombing of the television in Belgrade, or accusing President Zelensky of being someone like Saddam Hussein, etc., etc. So I don't know whether I have time to mention possible scenario of what the Putin's regime could do in the coming days or weeks. I don't know whether I have time, but one possibility would be just to extend, I come from minor to the maximum scenario. One possibility could be just to extend the territorial control of the so-called republics of Luhansk and Donetsk to other areas corresponding to the administrative divisions in Ukraine, to keep them as so-called independent republics, as the Russian government did with South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, or Transnistria in Moldova, to incorporate these so-called republics into the Russian Federation, as the Russian government did with Crimea, to occupy the rest of Ukraine, and to toppling the government with the idea to put a puppet regime, and to proceed to the annexation of the entire Ukraine. And all this scenario would be blatant and grave breaches of international law. So, to conclude, we are assisting to the development of a culture of force in international relations. And this is a regression, and I would say not to the Cold War period, even worse, not even to 1945, but even before 1928, so the Brand-Kellogg Pact, because now we are assisting as the proclamation in fact of war as an instrument of national policy, something that was banned precisely by the Brand-Kellogg Pact. And allow me to finish remembering what a distinguished Argentine jurist wrote in the 19th century after a devastating war in South America led by Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay against Paraguay. He wrote a book, The Crime of War, and he finished by saying, "War is a way to administer justice in which each party is at the same time the victim, the prosecutor, the witness, the judge, and the criminal." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, to walk us both through the scenarios and also inspiring us with the state of play from an international law perspective. As you mentioned, the question of if we are going to a new era of force, of where force becomes a new normal, this brings at the heart of the discussion the question of global order and the rules that are supposed to define global order, as well as the entities, the future of states, the nature of states. And this, Bala, if I might turn to you, brings us straight also in the reflections that the Hirschman Center on Democracy is reflecting on, where you are the co-director. So from a global order perspective, how do you make sense of what is happening in Ukraine right now?
Thank you, Keem. Before I begin, because as academics, and especially I'm a historian, we can lapse into generalities and abstractions. I want to begin by acknowledging that this is a very somber moment for all of us. We need to acknowledge the suffering of the people in Ukraine and people with connections to Ukraine, tens of millions of them, both in Ukraine and around the world. And even if I may not be speaking directly to Ukraine at the beginning of my intervention, I think we should all bear their thoughts in mind. The Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, like everyone else in this room, we are committed to a just, democratic, inclusive, and rules-based order. This order is now beset with fresh and dangerous uncertainties. And in co-hosting this event, the Albert Hirschman Center is keen to underscore the importance of this commitment as we try to grapple with these uncertainties in the wake of Russia's unjustified and brutal invasion of Ukraine. For a number of years, since the 1990s. Russia has been a revisionist power. What this invasion strongly signals is that Russia has flipped from being a revisionist power to embarking on a revanchist project. Time will tell whether Russia is going to emerge as a full-blown revanchist power. Even if this is just a revanchist project, there's a very big risk that the war in Ukraine will prolong and spread and escalate, not only to threaten Europe, but the entire world. I have to underline this rather obvious point because the European dimension of the crisis has attracted attention. In the last 250 years, however, Europe has been remarkably unsuccessful in containing conflicts in Europe to wars within Europe. So the whole world, I think, has a right to be concerned. Now, a just, democratic, inclusive, and rules-based international order is a mouthful. It can also be an oxymoron, because a just, democratic, and inclusive international order has to be rules-based. It cannot be otherwise. However, it does not follow that a rules-based order is necessarily just, democratic, or inclusive. The international order at any point in time is a constitutional settlement reflecting power relations at its point of origin, at the time of its origin. It changes slowly, if at all, and often very conditionally and contingently as power equations change. So revisionist projects and resistance to them are the stuff of international relations, of the dynamics of the international system. Most such projects play by the rules. Think here of the decades-long efforts of Brazil, Germany, India, and South Africa to expand the membership of the UN Security Council. They may lead to institutional innovations. Think here of China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, backed now by nearly 100 countries after its frustrations with attempting to reform multilateral financial institutions. Finance, of course, is far more amenable to calculative reason than strategic or security interests, especially as they play out in the minds of an isolated dictator. What has all this got to do with Ukraine? We should begin by recognizing that all powers or constellation of powers have revisionist interests. Think here of Brexit Britain, wanting to renegotiate the Brexit agreements within months of signing them, or US attitudes to various treaties and agreements. But some revisionist claims have systemic implications or affect incumbent powers in ways that challenge meaningful negotiations. And this is a real challenge for the international system as a whole. At the same time, negotiations are unavoidable if revisionism is not to be allowed to slide into revanchism. Europe, in some ways, leads the way in this respect, resolving decades of one-sided settlements, revisionist claims, and revanchist wars through processes of engagement. These hold important lessons for us. We should also recognize that elites in many countries around the world nurture revanchist fantasies. It's clear Putin has had them. He probably has had them since the 1990s. The wars in Chechnya had a revanchist dimension. We cannot peer into Putin's mind, the labyrinth of his mind, or speculate about it. But Russia's slide from revisionism, by which I mean a power that sought relatively peaceful revisions of the post-1990 security settlement in its neighborhood, to revanchism and war is bound to occupy historians for a long time to come. So a question I think historians are going to ask in the future, could this war have been prevented? War is a defeat for peace, as Akim pointed out, and the director underlined in her note yesterday. Could the Russian invasion have been forestalled? What could have been an acceptable price for forestalling it? Another question we might soon be asking, and I hope sooner than later, if the question is not to become moot, is what lessons do Russia's slide from revisionism to revanchism offer for managing or resolving other revisionist claims in ways that do not endanger world peace? The world is united, or nearly united, in condemning the Russian invasion, even as we all pray and fear an escalation and pray against it. Part of the credit for this unity must go to Putin. Even on the eve of the invasion, let's not forget, there were differences within the West, between France and Germany on the one hand, and the US-British axis on the other, about how to manage the Russian threat. There were equally crucial differences between the Ukrainian leadership and the US-British axis. It's important to keep these differences in mind and revisit them to resist an emerging narrative that the US-British axis was right all along in its assessment. This brutal war was always a foregone conclusion, and that Ukraine and France and Germany have been proved to have been naive about Putin. Because to give in to this narrative is to disarm ourselves and our ability to arrest future slides towards revanchism in other parts of the world. Recalling these differences may seem somewhat academic now, given especially the suffering of the Ukrainian people and their justified and complete disillusionment, if that is the right word, with Russia. But they may still be relevant to forging the peace. We also need to keep them in mind for managing relations in the future with other revisionist powers whose thoughts may be turning towards a revanchist war. Make no mistake, Putin and his close cronies, if he has any, and they alone are to blame for the war. But future historians will wonder whether the constant US-British drumbeats, at one point with real-time updates about Putin's preparations for war, were best calculated to achieve a disengagement. We know now that while Russia had mobilized its armor, its logistics were and remain in complete disarray. Even basic requirements like fuel do not seem to have been planned for. This is fortunate to the extent it's held back the Russian advance. But Russia's failure to motivate its troops may point to a large gulf between mobilization and invasion. The Ukrainian leadership may have been aware of this gulf, but could their voices have been drowned by the drumbeats of war of the US-British axis? Could these drumbeats have undermined the Franco-German peace effort? Could more respect have been shown to the Ukrainian reading of the situation, even perhaps while doing something unobtrusively to equip and train Ukrainian forces in a deterrent way to resist Russian invasion? The point I want to make is that the slide from revisionism to revanchism can be prevented, has to be prevented. The slide does not happen in a vacuum, but it's an interactive process involving other powers and interlocutors. Leaders motivated and determined to assert the status quo, whether or not beleaguered by Afghanistan or Brexit, and whether or not they nurse Rooseveltian aspirations and Churchillian fantasies, may not be best suited to preventing war or restoring peace. So to my three concluding points, revanchism must be fought and defeated. There's no alternative. But Ukraine underlines the imperative of making every reasonable effort to prevent or arrest the slide from revisionism to revanchism and war. Finally, the threat of revanchism is the strongest argument against the status quo. We should resist efforts to convert revanchism in war into a justification or an alibi for preserving the status quo. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bala, and also particularly pointing your fingers on sometimes the trap when these large monumental events happening to be entrapped in single factor explanations. Many European leaders are pointing the fingers to Vladimir Putin with of course a great degree of evidence that they're right in doing so. But also what you point out, that this is a moment to reflect on the broader responsibilities of the environment that we are living in, that also many other countries have shaped. That is, I think, a very important pointer. And that will be very important, as there will be at one point negotiations towards a peace agreement or peace building between European countries and Russia. Also, I think where you hint at is how we think about global order and possibly also war. And that is my bridge also to Erika, to you. Current imaginations about the war are really focusing on the battlefield. The tanks, the fleeing people, the destruction. But if we want to believe that warfare has changed, there is another space of warfare, which is the weaponization of economies as a part of the same conflict system. Now, as a senior researcher at the Center, at the Global Governance Center and the Geneva Center of Humanitarian Studies, and also you're the coordinator of the Geneva International Sanctions Network, that is kind of your space. Can you help us making sense of the activation of the economies for war in terms of sanctions?
Thanks, Hakim. I'll try my best to do so. It's quite strange, and as the others have said, distressing, saddening being here. Some 5 or 6 years ago, I was sitting in one of the other auditoriums here at the Institute with a team of colleagues from the Graduate Institute and from elsewhere around the world, a multidisciplinary team with which we looked into impacts and effectiveness of the earlier rounds of sanctions against Russia imposed by the EU and the US, and the costs that were felt by EU economies, by the economy in the US, and we explored scenarios and how to optimize the ways in which these sanctions are combined with other policy tools, such as the mediation, the peacekeeping efforts, wider diplomacy, and so on. So here we are again, and I'll hope to draw on some of those studies today. But let me start by saying that the sanctions that are in place on Russia today, that have been imposed over the past week alone, are absolutely unprecedented. We have never seen anything like it before in history. We have seen, of course, extremely broad, comprehensive sanctions regimes in the past, in the cases of Iraq, Yugoslavia, Cuba, Haiti, back in the 1990s and before. Over the coming 2 decades, we saw a turn to targeted sanctions as a way of minimizing humanitarian impacts of these kinds of measures. And then in recent times, we've seen, for a number of reasons, very hard-hitting, broad sanctions being imposed against countries like Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, and a few others. But the case of Russia today is really different, and there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, it's the first time that a major economy around the world has been sanctioned to this degree. Russia, as you know, is highly integrated into world financial markets, world trade, and so on, and that wasn't really the case with the other countries I've just mentioned. The trade relations with Europe in particular has been historically extremely strong, both ways, with imports and exports, so this has been another big consideration, particularly from European countries in the EU. The breadth of the measures are also unprecedented. So what we had back in 2014, 15, 16 were a series of asset freezes, travel bans, also measures like diplomatic sanctions, and some very highly targeted energy-related, finance-related measures. What we're seeing today is an amplification of that at a scale we haven't seen before, which now covers things like extremely sophisticated financial sanctions, hitting a whole range of different areas in the Russian system. We also see in the last couple of days sanctions being imposed against the central bank by the US, the EU, the UK. And again, this is the first time that a G20 country's central bank has been sanctioned. So you can start to appreciate some of the impacts that this may have into the long term and on a whole range of different levels when it comes to finance, trade, ordinary civilians, and so on. Another area is the speed with which these sanctions have been agreed. In the cases of the US, the EU, UK, Canada, recently Switzerland. And we also have to remember that European sanctions are also adopted by a whole range of Europe's neighbours as well, outside of the EU. So there's this kind of amplifying effect, and a number of other countries around the world as well. And these have been agreed in the space of a week. And we think of the cases of Iran and North Korea and some of the others. These developed over many years, sometimes a decade. So the economies and the governments had time to prepare in various different ways. You can, of course, argue that Russia has been preparing for this eventuality, securitizing its economy and doing various other steps in anticipation of the likely hit from sanctions. But the speed is again, hasn't been seen in history. The coordination is also interesting in that in the absence of action at the UN Security Council for obvious reasons, we're seeing an explosion of autonomous or unilateral sanctions around the world. And what we're seeing here is very close coordination now. A task force has been set up between the US, Canada, the EU and the UK to work to identify assets around the world that can be frozen and to work together on various other angles. So again, where in the past there was an absence of kind of formalized mechanisms or bodies to work together, we're seeing this kind of alternative collaboration going on outside of the UN context. And that's not surprising, of course, because what we're seeing is a member of the UN Security Council that not only has been carrying out its actions in Ukraine more recently, but also in recent years has made use of illegal chemical weapons in Europe against P5 residents in a P5 country, and a number of other breaches of international law and human rights abuses and so on. So let's turn to what the papers are saying. You have to open any newspaper and many of the articles are covering sanctions. And the question that they're often asking is, will the sanctions work? Are they hurting Russia? Are they going to change Putin's calculations? And I would say this is the wrong question to ask, even though it's the one that comes to a lot of people's minds. And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, is that sanctions don't exert an impact in isolation. There are so many other factors at play, and we need to consider them in unison. So there shouldn't be too much of a hope placed on sanctions that they're going to change the military activities or have major impacts on other levels. They need to be considered in concert alongside deterrence, defense, diplomacy, mediation, trade, covert activities, referrals to legal tribunals, and so on. And what we know from many decades of sanctions scholarship is this is one of the factors that heightens the effectiveness of sanctions. It's the way in which they're strategically combined with other policy tools. And all too often, these forms of strategic planning across the board isn't happening quite so effectively. Although in the Russian case, what we seem to be seeing is very close coordination of financial and military activities at the same time. What we also need to remember is that sanctions are having multiple types of impacts. They can be coercing a change in behavior, withdrawal of troops, pushing back, slowing down of military activities. They can also constrain the ability of the Russian government or Russian military and so on to do what it is doing at the moment, remove its access to technology or financing and other essential resources. Another area is signaling, and that's making a strong message within Russia and to other would-be detractors of international norms elsewhere in the world, and that's a very important function. And then you can also see that various countries are trying to influence one another in bringing others into the game and supporting some of the measures. Another area here is that we can't account for invisible impacts of sanctions. We can't know for sure what Putin is deciding to do or not to do behind the scenes and what calculation the sanctions are having as part of this. And some of the lessons from the past are that longer lasting sanctions tend to be less effective. So one of the strategies at the moment could be to hit extremely hard and fast in the hope that there will be some form of success. But the risk here, if we look at some of the other very high-profile crises around the world, is that these sanctions may stay in place for a very long time. And it gives the ability of the Russian economy and military and so on to adapt accordingly. We also know that the way in which the messaging of sanctions is included is really important. Governments and politicians need to know what they have to do in order to have the sanctions lifted and not just keep them in place over a very long period of time. And there are many other areas as well that we can draw on. And I think a final point here is that the humanitarian side of the house is one we should also think about, not least what's happening today in Ukraine, but also for the Russian people. There will be major costs incurred, and part of the fact at the moment is that the sanctions in place are not only intended to bring about some form of change in behavior, but also to punish. They're very much intended to have a punitive function at the moment. So what we need to do is decouple some of these arguments, and rather than asking, are they working, will they work, we think more widely about the wider policy, strategic approaches at play, and also not equate damage, economic damage or civilian damage to success, because ultimately that's not what the policies are there to do. A final point here is that there's something else going on, which is also happening around the world, which is a phenomenon that's termed financial sector de-risking. Now, this is where banks and financial institutions withdraw their services from certain countries because they're afraid of the ramifications of the sanctions. The fines can enter into the billions of dollars or euros. The bureaucratic burden is extremely heavy and significant for these institutions as well. So in many cases, it just makes sense to withdraw or reduce services or pull away completely from certain countries. And we've seen that in a number of other countries around the world. We're also seeing this across the wider private sector. Just in the last few days, companies such as Volvo, Disney, some shipping companies, insurance companies are all voluntarily pulling out of the country, and this is for a number of reasons. The commercial logic for remaining in a country like Russia is severely diminished at the moment. The political risk is extremely high, and also the risk of sanctions, fines, and other penalties. So a last point here is on what are some of the costs, because sanctioning a country as big and powerful as Russia comes with some forms of costs. And again, this is very different to when sanctions were imposed against the likes of Venezuela, Iran, North Korea. One of them is the hit that can be felt on trade. If we look at the US, this is incredibly minimal because the trade relationship with Russia, even back in the earlier, a decade ago, was a tiny fraction. I think it was under 1% of overall trade, whereas with the EU, it's a very high level of trade that was going on. In our earlier studies, what we found was some quite interesting results. The countries in Europe that were complaining most about the economic damage of the measures were actually some of those that were losing out the least, and that includes the likes of Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Hungary, and so on. The ones that were losing out the most in terms of lost trade were the Baltic states, Russia's neighbours. And so it went to show that the economic argument is not necessarily the strongest one here. There are other considerations at play. What we saw in the European context is that trade in agriculture, for example, in apples and a number of other goods, was very rapidly diverted to new markets. So there was also various mechanisms in Europe that served to support the industry. There's also a risk of countermeasures in the Russian context. It could be in terms of shutting down gas supplies, which we've seen in the past. It could be in the form of retaliatory cyber attacks, and we've seen a number of these recently in response to sanctions as well, coming from a number of countries. This could include cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in sender countries. And then, of course, we have the military risks that we also know about. So I think I'll conclude here, the fact that the sanctions have been so broad and unprecedented highlights the severity of the situation and the existential threat to Europe, but at the same time, the fact that those imposing the sanctions are willing to incur such big risks and costs as well is a really important one. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika, for highlighting the unprecedented nature of what we're seeing from an expert perspective, and also placing your comments within the context of the integrated nature of economies. This is surely also something that brings us to Switzerland, and that brings us to you, Sarah. You are a senior researcher at the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding, and visiting lecturer in the International Relations and Political Science department here. Now, we've seen the canton of Zug has been very heavily impacted, not only because Nord Stream 2 has gone bankrupt and has from one day to the next fired 140 people, but there is in fact no knowledge yet how it will impact the Swiss economy due to the significant exposure to the Russian economy. Then there is the tight walk between neutrality and engagement in Switzerland that I'm sure you can help us understand.
Yes, thank you very much, Achim. So my comments broadly relate to peace promotion in a changing world order. And I'll make 3 comments. The first relates to Switzerland and basically the balancing of neutrality and economic sanctions. The second, more broadly, to restoring peace. And then the third, to the broader implications for the current world order. And we have heard, of course, others also reflecting on this. So first, on Switzerland's decision to take over the EU economic sanctions. So as many of you know, the Swiss position was basically formed, if we can say so, in 2 steps. So there was first the announcement on the 25th of February that Switzerland will actually not, at least in a first step, take over all the EU sanctions, but only adopt so-called anti-circumvention measures, meaning that it will make sure not to be used as a platform to circumvent sanctions imposed by the EU. But then, on Monday this week, the Federal Council actually announced that it will now adopt the full range of sanctions put in place by the EU. So why this change? I think apart from really massive pressure, both domestically from the population, but also the Swiss parliament, as well as internationally, mostly from the EU, the main discussion actually turned around whether sanctions were compatible with Swiss neutrality. So what does neutrality mean? Neutrality has a legal and a political component. And legally speaking, neutrality means that Switzerland is not allowed to participate in an armed conflict either directly or by indirectly supporting the conflict parties. Politically, it gets a little bit more tricky because neutrality can, of course, be interpreted differently, and its concrete definition actually is discussed in each particular case. So now in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Federal Council decided in the end that the economic sanctions on Russia were compatible with Swiss neutrality, which is also the majority opinion as recent surveys have shown. And I think there were 2 main reasons for this decision. First, and most importantly, as we all know, the war is against international law as it violates the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And neutrality does not mean not to speak out against such clear violations of international law. And especially Switzerland as a small state, of course, has a particular interest in upholding international law and territorial integrity. The second reason, I think the main concern of Switzerland with the economic sanctions was also that it could preclude a role for Switzerland in proposing its good offices, as Russia would not consider it as neutral anymore. However, I think Putin had to expect very strong reactions from the West, including from Switzerland. And I also think there's still a qualitative difference between countries sanctioning Russia economically and those sending weapons. So Switzerland can still be considered as a relatively more neutral actor. So in the end, it was somewhat of a balancing act and a bit an unfortunately communication strategy, if I may call it like this. But I think that the Federal Council in the end did not really have another option than to take over the EU sanctions. Now, my second point about restoring peace. We have seen, as a response now to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, massive mobilization with governments announcing drastic increases in their defense spending and sending weapons to Ukraine. This is understandable, as we're all angry and the aggressor is clear, but we also have to recall that in the long term, what we need is a political solution. So what political solutions are actually, or what political options are actually there to solve this conflict? We know, and it has been mentioned, the UN Security Council is blocked for obvious reasons, but we have this UN General Assembly resolution that was actually adopted yesterday in an emergency special session under the Uniting for Peace formula. It deplores Russia's actions and calls for the immediate withdrawal of its forces. And this is quite groundbreaking because 140 states were actually in favor and only 5 against and 35 abstains. So this sends a very strong signal that the majority of states still wants this conflict to stop and peace negotiations to start. But where can peace negotiations even start if we have so fundamentally opposed positions of the conflict parties? Ukraine and Russian delegations have met twice. They are currently meeting, if the meeting is not over yet. And we know from mediation theory, actually, that the best moments for negotiations are when 2 conditions are fulfilled. First, the parties find themselves in what is called a mutually hurting stalemate. Meaning that no party can actually unilaterally escalate the conflict so as to win it militarily, and that the situation inflicts very high costs on both sides. And we are arguably not there, because Russia is likely to still think that it can win this war militarily, or at least further strengthen its bargaining position by pursuing the military battle. However, the massive and unprecedented sanctions and international isolation, of course, make this war much more hurtful for Russia. The second condition for successful negotiations is that the parties must, of course, consider negotiations as a way out, as a viable alternative to fighting. And also here, I think, in the current situation, we are quite far removed, as diplomacy has failed so far and no one is yet ready to make compromises. However, the General Assembly resolution may give negotiations more or new impetus. So still at the moment, I think we are in a situation where we shouldn't place too many expectations towards talks. But it is very important and fundamental that communication channels actually remain open, as it is key to negotiate a cessation of hostilities as soon as possible. And a third point I would like to make, or third set of reflections I would like to share on the broader implications of this for the current world order. In these past days, we have often heard about how radical the implications of the Russian invasion are and how it marks a turning point. I agree, and I think no one would put that into doubt, that the events are drastic. But I think, and I think previous speakers have also alluded to this, I think we also need to see the continuity of the events and not just the rupture. So in my view, the Ukrainian war is the final wake-up call that we live in a new world, a multipolar world where we need to acknowledge that there has not been an end of history or an end of geopolitics. We are shocked because we took peace in Europe for granted. And we are shocked because everyone, I think, still hoped to some extent that Putin would still play according to the rules of the game. In other words, respect international law and resolve conflicts through diplomacy rather than war, at least when major powers are involved. But he did not. However, this development, as we know, did not happen overnight. In particular, we have seen a weakening of multilateralism and of the norm of peacefully setting conflicts rather than through force over the past decades, also related to the war on terror and unilateral actions by certain states. And I think Putin's current actions are clearly a manifestation of this new world order. The events in the next few days and weeks will be determinant to see in which direction we will go. The massive solidarity with Ukraine shows that the vast majority of states and societies still condemns actions that violate international law. But beyond that, the question really is, how can we adapt current conflict resolution instruments to this new world order that is being shaped actually as we speak? How can we adapt our current conflict resolution instruments in order to halt violence, to stop violence in Ukraine, as well as in other currently ongoing and potentially future erupting conflicts? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and particularly highlighting the European dimensions of this security crisis and this war, where, of course, many European observers have been woken up. Which is, of course, a reality that many observers and populations from elsewhere in the world are much more familiar to, the reality of war. And this is why we want to now shift the town hall also into the dimension of perspectives from elsewhere in the world onto the war in Ukraine. Et je suis très content que, Eric, tu es avec nous ici pour nous donner une perspective africaine sur la guerre qui était en train de se dérouler en Ukraine.
Merci beaucoup, Achim. Je voudrais tout d'abord préciser que nous parlons ici de peuples, de personnes qui sont sur le terrain et qui souffrent de la guerre. Et je voudrais avoir une pensée particulière pour ces hommes et ces femmes victimes aujourd'hui de la guerre. Alors, il m'a été demandé d'offrir une perspective africaine sur les défis actuels. Et j'aimerais commencer à indiquer que l'Afrique est une réalité plurielle. Donc, je n'ai pas l'ambition d'offrir une perspective africaine. Je partagerai volontiers quelques éléments sur la position d'un certain nombre de pays africains, en insistant d'abord sur le fait que les pays africains ont toujours été en faveur de la paix et du droit international. Et je rappellerai ici simplement, lors de la création de l'OUA, l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine, comment le principe juridique de uti possidetis iuris a été consacré et qui pose vraiment l'ancrage sur le respect des frontières territoriales. Et aujourd'hui, évidemment, tous les pays africains sont en faveur de la paix et pour la plupart se sont positionnés clairement contre cette agression. J'aimerais aussi indiquer que la guerre, les conflits armés sont une réalité assez courante sur le continent. Nous compatissons tous évidemment par rapport à ce qui se passe aujourd'hui, mais je rappelle que ces 2 dernières décennies, les activités du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies se sont essentiellement focalisées sur des situations conflictuelles en Afrique. Alors, pour donner un peu de perspective à mon propos, je vous ai mis ici une carte sur le vote des pays africains lors de l'Assemblée générale. Vous verrez que la plupart des pays africains, évidemment, ont voté contre l'intervention de la Russie. Alors, il y a un seul pays qui a voté contre cette résolution et il y a un certain nombre de pays qui se sont abstenus. Mais je dirais que dans l'ensemble, on voit ici un engagement fort de l'Afrique pour la paix et en tout cas contre le recours à la force armée comme manière de régler des différends sur la scène mondiale. En tant que politiste, j'aimerais quand même indiquer que quelques pays se sont probablement abstenus au regard des logiques de rapport de force, tout simplement, et aussi peut-être par rapport au retour de la Russie sur le continent africain. Il faut bien garder à l'esprit que depuis quelques années, la Russie est redevenue, si elle était partie, un acteur prépondérant sur le continent africain. Je ne mentionnerai pas ici nommément des pays où la Russie a une présence prééminente. Mais on peut suivre, on peut lire en tout cas la position de certains pays comme étant la réponse d'une situation d'asymétrie, en tout cas d'une situation où ces pays subissent un peu la pression forte de la Russie. Sur l'Érythrée, qui est le seul pays qui a voté contre, je dirais probablement qu'on voit ici, et je fais écho au propos de Erika Moret, on voit probablement la réaction d'un pays qui a beaucoup subi de sanctions internationales ces dernières années et qui, de manière sui generis, perçoit probablement cette discussion comme une manière d'envoyer le signal que les sanctions ne répondent pas nécessairement aux problèmes de ce type. Je voudrais maintenant venir sur un point qui me tient beaucoup à cœur, parce qu'on peut regretter que, bien entendu, la crise sécuritaire et humanitaire, en lien avec la guerre en Irak, nous donne à voir des logiques d'asymétrie au niveau de l'ordre mondial. Et surtout au niveau de l'ordre juridique international. Et j'aimerais prendre peut-être l'exemple de la possibilité pour des citoyens et citoyennes originaires d'Afrique qui sont actuellement en Ukraine de pouvoir accéder à l'espace européen. Tous les instruments juridiques internationaux sont clairs. En situation de crise, en situation de guerre, lorsqu'un individu cherche, refuse, on doit lui donner l'occasion de pouvoir accéder à un autre territoire parce que simplement il fuit. Ce qui se passe, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, il n'est pas toujours simple pour des ressortissants africains qui sont en Ukraine de pouvoir accéder au territoire européen. Et cela m'amène peut-être à élaborer sur le fait que finalement une crise humanitaire permet de percevoir comment les logiques d'asymétrie et les rapports de puissance jouent aussi à l'échelle humaine, pour ne pas dire à l'échelle individuelle. Pourtant, je rappellerai ici le cadre juridique africain qui est évidemment bien ancré dans les valeurs qui sont celles portées par les pays africains, les valeurs d'hospitalité, les valeurs d'accueil. Je mettrai simplement l'emphase sur la Convention de Kampala de 2009, qui est le cadre juridique africain pour gérer les questions de mobilité humaine, notamment pour les déplacés en temps de conflit armé. Nous avons bien entendu le document de référence de l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine de 1969. Tous ces instruments juridiques qui offrent la perspective africaine sont clairs. Quand une personne fuit la guerre, on l'accueille, sans savoir si elle est verte, violette, noire, bleue ou autre. Et ce que nous donne à voir la crise aujourd'hui, c'est que cette réalité n'est pas toujours, ou en tout cas cette perspective n'est pas toujours partagée partout. Vous voyez ici que beaucoup de pays se sont abstenus, un certain nombre de pays africains ont eu le courage de voter pour, mais d'autres se sont abstenus. J'y vois certainement une manière de ne pas choisir, mais je vois surtout, pour un certain nombre de pays que je ne veux pas citer nommément, une manière d'éviter toute forme de représailles dans ce contexte. Et cela m'amène au point sur les logiques de rapport de force. L'ordre mondial aujourd'hui, le système international, est toujours articulé sur les logiques de rapport de force. Et quand les acteurs supposés de la périphérie, pour ne pas dire les acteurs subalternes, doivent se positionner sur des sujets importants, il n'est pas toujours simple de faire un choix. on doit constater aussi avec regret que la guerre n'est pas un phénomène qui a disparu. La guerre va demeurer malheureusement un phénomène du système international qu'il faut probablement régler. La guerre entendue comme cet embrasement social qui mobilise toutes les énergies. Mais je voudrais terminer mon propos peut-être en partageant avec vous ce que disait Léopold Sédar Senghor en 1963 lors de la création de l'OUA, de l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine. Senghor disait, je dis qu'alors, ressuscitant les vertus de Saint-Augustin et d'Ibn Khaldoun, ressuscitant les vertus de nos bâtisseurs, de nos sculpteurs, de nos peintres, de nos poètes, au nord et au sud du Sahara, l'Afrique contribuera puissamment à l'édification de la civilisation de l'universel. Par son unité, elle aura été auparavant un facteur de paix. De cette paix sans laquelle il n'est pas de civilisation. Et je voudrais donc dire, peut-être en bon utopiste, que, je fais écho à Pierre Asner, le geste asnérien pourrait nous inspirer pour œuvrer ensemble à créer cet universel pluriel entendu ici comme une manière de recomposer l'ordre mondial par-delà les logiques d'alliance, pacte de Varsovie, OTAN, etc., mais en recentrant peut-être cette configuration autour de ce qui devrait constituer la première des valeurs, le premier des principes, l'être humain, les hommes et les femmes. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Eric. And perhaps one element that speaks to me out of your presentation is that as European leaders and different constituencies are thinking about a new peace order for Europe, they might finally have the openness also to listen in what can be drawn and learned from other parts in the world that Europe can inspire itself from. While many lessons learned have always been projected outward into other continents, now it's perhaps the moment to request lessons learned, to absorb it into your own structuring of your peace system back in Europe. So thank you very much for these perspectives. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a good half hour now to open up to all of you. We have global student populations, we have colleagues from all over the world. Please feel free to bring in your own perspectives from your own regions or your own interpretations that can help us unpack what we are just seeing in Ukraine. And please raise your hand and I'll come with you. Of course, I also encourage those who are joining us online to send your questions in the chat. And as you are thinking about your questions, I do note that this session is on the record and is recorded. I should possibly have told this to our speakers before they spoke, but I did tell them, I think, in writing. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you.
And please briefly introduce yourself as you start.
My name is Samuele, and I'm a first-year master's student here at the Graduate Institute in Global Security. I have a question about the sanctions. Do you think that the timing of sanctions is appropriate right now? Because I think that Putin is facing a very high cost internally now, and don't you think that maybe sanctions now are creating some sort of paradox that gives him like a rational incentive to scale up operations and generally scale up operation and escalate the war because he's facing a very high cost internally?
Just hold back. I saw other hand up just over there, exactly, and then we have one more in the middle here. Just there. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Kamala. I'm a first-year student of Master of International Law. I come from Azerbaijan, and this should tell you something already. And there was a question asked by you, Mr. Venma. Is war a new tool for power politics? And I say no, it's not new. It has been tolerated so far. And I tell you, there are lots of wars around the world, lots of, let's call it conflicts, wars, whatever you prefer, that where Russia is involved directly or indirectly. There are also wars around the world where Russia is not involved. And this has been tolerated with different excuses, such as Security Council. And now we see that there is a way to circumvent those mechanisms of the UN that prevent you from taking an action. And my point here, and I let you categorize this, whether this is a comment or a question, is that for as long as there are double standards in the world in terms of treating conflicts and wars, and for as long as some are tolerated vis-a-vis the other, this is not the last war we are seeing, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think if you are... And I think if you are looking at a lot of the research, which is being both done by the Graduate Institute and others on peace and conflict situations, you will see that this distinction is very clearly made. That, of course, if you enter the political sphere, it becomes different. But this is where we, as academics, we have the opportunity to look at conflict through the different disciplinary lenses, or from, of course, also from an interdisciplinary perspective to call out these elements of duplicity. We had a question right here, the gentleman in the gray shirt, and afterwards we can immediately go to the left. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Marmer Burka. I'm also a first-year student here at the International Institute. I come from Bosnia, and over the last 7 days, people have just been stockpiling on fuel and flour because we went through war in the 90s and we know what it means. And we also have a saying in Bosnian that says that once a snake bites you, you're afraid of a lizard. So that's just kind of like what's happening back home. But what I wanted to ask is, I was listening to a lecture, and I heard that in, I think it was Frankfurter Zeitung, that 6 months before World War I, there was a big column that said that the war is over and will never happen again. And as you know, I mean, World War I happened, and given how the situation has been escalating, like, I've been seriously concerned, like, are we walking towards another global conflict?
Well, at least what I can mention is that even the microphone to the lady over there, even in this town, 2 days before the start of the war, many senior diplomats were still laughing at a prospect of a war in Ukraine because they think it would not happen. So is history repeated, perhaps? Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. My name is Aurélie. I'm a second-year student, MIA, currently studying international affairs. And as it's been mentioned by, I assume to be another colleague of mine, military conflicts have happened throughout the ages. And particularly this one, what I find interesting is that, as it was mentioned, I think, by the first speaker, military interventions and the techniques that are being used by the Russians have been used by the West previously. And I mean, when it comes to the US military interventions, we're looking at Kuwait, Somalia, Iraq, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Argentina, Chile, Greece. I can go down a list. But I think it's partly a question, partly a comment. What is currently happening in Ukraine feels very much like a military intervention the US would go about. And it seems as though the reason why it is called a war is because the opponents, the Ukrainians, are allowed the agency to fight back, or allowed the assumption that they are in a situation of aggression, which is the case. But in certain conflicts that the US have been involved in, the population that faces that aggression have often been called, or have often been categorized as insurgents, terrorists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What is so different about this conflict and the current outrage of the world as opposed to other conflict that US interventions have sparked?
Thank you. There was one more hand up in here. Yes, exactly. The gentleman in the middle with the pink shirt. And then we go for one additional reflection here. And you get one short moment to reflect on some of the observations which you heard. Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarthak Roy, and I'm an alumni of the LLM here at the Graduate Institute. So my question is this the moment when Leo Tolstoy is proven right, that the humanization of warfare perpetuated by the US post 9/11 is leading to further wars and not going beyond them? The diminishing of anti-war movement has led to further wars. Are we at the cusp of Leo Tolstoy being proven right and not someone like Michael Walzer? Or do we see, on the other hand, with the mushrooming of so many legal petitions and all the courts being taken up to, Russia is being taken to various courts, do we see that lawfare might ultimately triumph warfare going forward after this crossroads that we are at? And this is a question for primarily Professor Cohen and Professor Balachandran. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another hand up right here. Yes, please.
Okay, hello. My name is Mohammad Reza. I'm a PhD student in ANSO department, and I did my master research on the implications of Trump sanctions on Iran since 2018. And I just wanted to ask here that, well, I think what everyone is here implying is that the discourse here is that, this is unprecedented, we haven't seen such a thing, and the rest of it. And, measures are being taken accordingly, right, according to this unprecedented situation. What I want to say is that the cultural implication here is that this I would say, centric view that this is unprecedented is leading to a kind of resentful, attitude globally, in the sense that, why they are saying that this is unprecedented. We have seen this. These people even are not, respecting our experiences, our sufferings, and the rest. I just wanted to ask how it is possible to adopt a new discourse here that doesn't lead to this fraction globally, which will, I'm afraid, possibly translate into other conflicts, right? We are seeing implications of energy fraction, which is completely fatal for, climate change and the rest of it. I'm just trying to ask how we can change this discourse so, European countries, especially the US, take up some of the guilt here, accept that they've done things mistakenly, and how they want to, stop this thing to be, reused or abused from a different party that is coming from a different, global, power or whatever. I think what we need is to think about this, not to, add suffering to those people who have been experiencing this stuff, and now seeing that, okay, some people are waking up. This is, I think, we should think through, and I propose it as an anthropologist or as a student of anthropology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have also had a number of questions from our audience online. So, Dan, what did you hear?
Thank you, Akim. A lot of questions online, over 15 right now and counting. A lot of questions on sanctions, but I know some have already been asked in the room, but a few have come in about China, which I find quite interesting. So the first one is, what can you say about China's position and interests and role in this war and situation? And the second China-related question is, as a researcher from China, I would like to know how this conflict will affect China's future role in European affairs. Does China's behavior these days mean it is a change of process from a global China to a localized China? Finally, from a broader perspective, will this conflict lead to a new global order development?
Thank you very much. So time is always too short at town halls, and I have the impression we need to speak much more, of course. But could I invite our distinguished colleagues to reflect very briefly on one of the items you have heard? As this is a town hall, this is also an open-ended space, which I invite you to just briefly comment on. And perhaps, Marcelo, I start with you.
Okay, with pleasure. I refer to this idea of force is something that finally, at the end of the day, can be used in international relations. So you have many different states from many different regions of the world using force. So in spite of the fact that you have Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter of the United Nations, and then there must be this idea that force now is permitted in international relations. And I would like to stress exactly the opposite. It is true, so one of our students mentioned double standards, the fact that in some occasions some states condemn the use of force by another, while at the same time they have used force in another circumstances. But the figures that we saw with regard to the voting at the General Assembly yesterday, so you have 141 states remembering us that the prohibition of the use of force is a fundamental rule in international law even today. And I believe that coherency must be something not only for academics, but also for those having responsibility in the conduct of national policies. One of the matters of concern that I just mentioned when I spoke was the fact that President Putin is using similar arguments that were used in the past. But these arguments have no ground, and you cannot invoke, as President Putin mentioned, so we were warning, he said, the West, after Kosovo, that there will be consequences. After Iraq, there would be consequences. But the right answer is not to do the same. The right answer is to pursue political objectives through political means and not through the war. This is a very important lesson I think we have to take into consideration. So we have to oppose to this culture of force, which I mentioned a moment ago, a culture of peace, and this is the responsibility of all of us. And we also have to see that if there are inconsequential breaches of international law, it doesn't mean that international law doesn't exist anymore. It means that there is a disregard, and it's the only possibility to have normal relations through the respect of international law. A word with regard to sanctions. Obviously, as President Biden said, so there are two alternatives, either sanctions or war. Obviously, war is not possible, no need to explain why. Then sanctions. But one has to think about whether sanctions will produce or achieve the purposes, and what are the consequences. Because if we saw the manner in which sanctions were applied in other cases, who suffered? Essentially the peoples of the states concerned, and not their leaders. So now there is a need to strongly react in face of this aggression by the Russian Federation, but we have to think not only in the short run, but also in the middle and in the long run about the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you. As we are on sanctions, Erica, would you like to be next? Just keep on speaking.
Okay. Well, I'll actually try and, with one answer, I'll try and cover a few of the sanctions-related questions.
And just very briefly, because we're running out of time.
So building on what Marcelo just said, we often hear that sanctions play a role between war and words, but I would say here, this is actually wrong. It needs to play a role alongside war and words. We've seen that diplomacy through the Minsk talks and the Normandy format was at its limits here. So sanctions is just one of many other tools that are being employed. Talking about whether a new kind of form of sanctions practice, a new way of seeing the tool is needed. I've been arguing this for many years, and Mohamed Reza, we've discussed this already in my sanctions course, but I think it's a moment where we're at a kind of crisis point with sanctions. At the same time, we don't have alternative tools, so it's really important that they are used judiciously and strategically here in a way that minimizes impacts on ordinary civilians. And the reason I mentioned unprecedented, I will stick to my argument that the impact here could be similar, of course, to North Korea, Iran, and other countries, but the fact is that the ripple effect will be felt so much more strongly across the world when it comes to energy market, financial markets, and so on. So we really are going to see this as, I think, a turning point when it comes to how sanctions are used and should be used. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, please.
Thank you very much. I, of course, fully agree also with the comments that were made about double standards and the Eurocentric perspective, and this is also what I actually wanted to hint at when I said that there is continuity. Of course, it is not just now that we see such an attack, and as was mentioned now, I think several times, it's the rhetoric that Putin uses and kind of a larger acceptance of interference into the internal affairs of a state, of course, has not developed now with this attack, but has actually its roots earlier. And similarly, also the decline of the rules-based order is not just kind of something that comes from outside. It is also something that has crumbled actually inside within the EU, but also within, if we can call it the West more broadly. And I think we need to be aware of that. And maybe just a last reflection. I think now, of course, everything is kind of in war mood, and we know that war polarizes and war is about blocks, etc. And I think as researchers and as kind of observers, we also have a responsibility to get over the blocks. So we hear a lot about East-West, about democracy against autocratic regimes, etc. And I think now it's really the time to build bridges rather than to reiterate those dichotomies and binaries.
Yeah, thank you. That's, I think, extremely important that harkens back to our role of who we are, I think, as an institute. Eric, please.
Yes, two very quick comments. First one on sanctions. Just to say that we have to keep in mind that sanctions usually have negative impacts on an unintended impact on populations. The majority of sanctions right now for the UN are in the global south, especially African countries, and we know how these measures have a negative impact, first of all, on population. But there are very limited options in the current situation to deal with the position of Russia. I would say that it is very important to always keep the door open or half open for dialogue. And I think this is the best way to proceed because if we want to, again, push for sustainable peace, it means that we need to always find spaces for dialogue and trying to give preference to common denominator than what divide us.
Thank you. And Bala, as the co-host, co-organizer of this meeting, the last word goes to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate these very thoughtful questions. I'll just speak to two of them and then wind up my intervention, which is the whole question of moral outrage, selective moral outrage, and double standards. I don't think our moral outrage against war can or should ever be selective. Some wars are more visible than others. Many wars are invisibilized. But, you know, I think to preserve the integrity of our outrage, we can't afford our outrage to be selective. Sometimes our outrage echoes that of the powers that we don't trust, but that's no reason for us to abstain from outrage. What we can do more creatively with that outrage is to see how we can intervene to channel our collective outrage in ways that can check the kind of outrage that the great powers selectively bring to their attitudes to war. Perhaps there'll soon be a day when in Europe we will need to revive a movement against war and militarism, because one likely consequence of Ukraine is perhaps that the remilitarization of Europe could not only prove devastating for Europe, but it could also release US and British energies to focus on the Indo-Pacific and create more aggressive conditions there. So what happens in Europe can be crucial for peace in the whole world. There are also smaller areas where perhaps we can intervene. The nature of sanctions, for example, is something that's already been raised. I sometimes wonder, I know that people in Ukraine have asked for Stinger missiles, but I sometimes wonder whether arming the Ukrainian, giving Stinger missiles may actually not lead to more artillery bombardment and the use of missiles in ways that's far more destructive, that escalates hostilities and takes us closer to a Europe-wide or a worldwide conflagration. I'm not saying that's bound to happen, but those are the kind of things that we can talk about, think about, even as we recognize the importance of our moral outrage. Don't abstain from outrage just because it echoes the voices of the great powers, yet in some ways separate our agendas from the agendas of the great powers, because I think there's a general sentiment in this room that status quo can no longer be a guarantee against war. And in fact, if you have to prevent wars in the future, we not only need a rules-based order, but also a more just and democratic rules-based order. And in order to do that, I don't think we can really give up our outrage against war. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also highlighting the need to reflect what happened to the peace movement in Europe and the world. And this is surely something where you have a willing co-conspirator in me to reflect on this further. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude this town hall with a minute of silence to honor the victims on all sides in the war in Ukraine and in other wars worldwide. Please join me in observing a minute of silence.